Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Next Generation Collaboration, the sixth and final episode of our Nemertes Emerging Technologies Research Series. I'm Jerry Murphy, Nemertes Senior Vice President of Research and Consulting. Presenting with me today is Nemertes Research Fellow Marc Seybold. He's a former CEO of SUNY at Old Westbury and past chair of SUNY Council of CIOs. We'd like to encourage you to submit as many questions as you have along the way. We might address some of them right away, but in any case, we'll certainly make sure to leave time at the end for questions. And with that, let's get going, Marc.
Okay, let's get to the first slide.
It shows that it's up to me.
Well, let's get to the next slide. The one that's got some content that's interesting. So the slide is dead. Long live the slide. The more things change, the more we find that they're kind of newer versions of things that we're already familiar with. And sometimes maybe it's a good idea if we start inventing new words, because we're still using that slide word when I think the last of those things disappeared a very long time ago.
It is interesting how technology terms seem to say. I'm a big golfer, and people will still say, I'm hitting my 3-wood. Well, they haven't been wood for probably 30 years now. And yet somehow a lot of people, there are people starting to say 3-metal, but as a golfer, it still feels better to say wood than metal, even though the fact is they are all metal now. So
yeah, it's strange how these words survive. And I'm about to use it, right? We still say next slide. So here are the themes that we saw when we took a look at the next batch of collaboration tools. There's a return of agency to individuals. And about 2 weeks after we first did this, Nidal gave the head of Microsoft a keynote speech at a conference, and he actually brought up the same point, that one of the directions, themes that we see things going in is allowing people to have much more control over these environments, as opposed to the totally centralized, and maybe you could put a skin on it, or you're in a channel on one of the services and you can give it a name and a little icon or something like that. But that's not really agency. It's not allowing people to shape it in the way that they need it, and also to regain control over it. That's another one of the points that we're seeing. Reducing cognitive load. This is a really big thing, and the idea comes out of the aircraft business, both in civilian airliners and fighter pilots. A lot of these interfaces are at the point where they get in the way of being able to do something. And we see that even internally, where there's at least 3 different tools, and somebody says, well, just go look at it. It's right there. And it's like, it's right where and in which tool? So we need things where the interfaces begin to disappear, and that's starting to happen. And then at the same time and sense, they do become more organic, that it's something that we've got built-in intuitions for, as opposed to something that we explicitly have to learn about. Pendulum looks like it's swinging away from disintermediation. And there's a maybe on that, because there's a lot of talk with Web3 about how things are going to go back from a centralized environment into a lot more local control. But it's not clear that in the end that's how it'll play out. We're seeing that even today with a lot of the Web3 technologies, where the economics just tend to favor consolidation, even if it starts out as something that's very distributed.
And I'll tell you, Marc, from between that point and the one to return to agency, I think you're always going to have a dynamic balance between allowing creativity and autonomy for the individual versus I've got a corporation, I got a corporate standard, and I want whatever you're doing to fit within my, enterprise framework. And I think you're always going to have that pendulum swing where, things get autonomous, and then all of a sudden we see that with like bringing devices, right? It used to be, here's our standard desktop, laptop, you have that. Then it's like, bring your own device. Then what people realize, hey, individuals got freedom, but now I have security problems, lack of standardization, harder to fix things. Where do you disambiguate? Where is it the responsibility of the end user versus the responsibility of IT of the company? I think those similar things are going to happen in collaboration. You're going to have that balance, and if it gets too far on the individual side, it's going to create its own set of problems for the enterprise they're going to have to deal with.
Well, and you kind of have a funny outcome with the decentralization and the bring your own device, because maybe you had 50 different types of pads and cell phones to deal with, right? But how many applications were they running on it?
Well, exactly. I mean,
So everybody winds up, they've got Slack or something like that, or whatever the favored choices inside the organization. So what happened to the disintermediation and
yeah.
the centralization? Yeah, right on point there. One of the other things that's interesting, and this is coming out of the DAOs on the blockchain technology, is more and more people are being exposed to novel consensus protocols, and especially when it comes to voting. So most people are familiar with plurality elections, which is the kind that we have in the US for the most part, where everybody just votes for whoever their favorite candidate is or a topic, and then that's the winner. And we see that in polls all the time. Those are the same thing as plurality elections. But they have a lot of problems, and it's not widely known in the general public. There's an entire subsection of science that's devoted strictly to analyzing and looking at voting protocols and what can you do with them, and what are the implications of the different ways, and there are many more different ways than people realize of counting up votes.
You're starting to see experiments with that, right? New York City did this recently with their mayor election, and you see this actually the country of Ireland did this with their national elections, where you actually rank order candidates. And basically, let's say you have 10 candidates, you basically vote for your order. Who do you want first? Who do you want second? Who do you want third? And you basically drop out the bottom person until eventually the person with the most points wins, who may not be the person who got all the most number one votes, because you get polarizing figures like I won't say any people, but a politician who's incredibly polarizing, where there's 30% absolutely love that person, but then everybody else really hates them. That kind of voting with that type of consensus protocol, where you do the rank ordering, you might get a candidate that wins that's actually everybody's number two and nobody's number one.
Yep, the instant runoff elections, that's what New York City's council switched to. And I can't remember if it's Vermont or New Hampshire, but one of the states uses it, I think, statewide for all elections, including the federal Senate and House positions. And you're starting to see also that as more people are exposed to them and they actually get used in practice as opposed to just academic exercises, is that people are realizing that there is no one size fits all for every situation. So one of the more interesting things that's popped up in the DAOs is something that they're calling holographic voting. And basically they run a prediction market, and so they borrowed the idea from holograms, where if you break up the hologram plate, even the smallest part, still has everything in it. And they're using that to kind of control the total number of things that come up for votes, and forcing people to pay a bit more attention to, is this actually something that we need to worry about before we go through the effort of actually having a discussion and a vote on it. So we're likely to see these things spill over into governance and collaboration tools. It's a really exciting part of it, and it's kind of flying under a lot of people's radars. We're also going into a fair division discussion, because at the same time, once you've got these mechanisms in place and people are used to using it, a lot of what comes up for votes turns out to be, how do we allocate something fairly, or in some cases unfairly, but for the most part, the question is, how do we have a fair and reasonable allocation? And so we're going to get that almost as a freebie as people are exposed to these novel consensus protocols. And all of a sudden, a lot of people are going to start talking about a guy named Marc de Condorcet, who's a kind of pivotal person in these voting protocols. Died. He was during the French Revolution, so he's long dead, but his work lives on. We're also starting to move away in the collaboration tools from kind of static information transfer, where it's a presentation in some sense, because many of these tools are still one individual as the presenter. I mean, it's kind of baked into the terminology evenly. And we're beginning to see trends that go towards modeling systems, and then people start to modify the model in real time, whether it's a mechanical system that you can have as an AR model, and people actually see it with the glasses, or it's something that's more like a simulation and people can twiddle the knobs and the dials and then dynamically see how it responds. And both Microsoft and Google are morphing their documents into these infinite canvases. They've kind of borrowed that from some of the smaller players, and creating 2D live objects, and live in a sense that they're actually links to some other data source. It could be somebody else that's maintaining a document, and a lot of other people have the link in that, but everybody can edit it and sees the changes in real time. But it's morphing away from being something that's static, and definitely the idea of or the mental image of some kind of standard fixed dimension page is starting to go away. So part of what's changing is the I hate the word like milieus and paradigms because they're really overused. But there's a certain level of mind expansion that's about to happen as people have opportunities to rethink how these things are handled, how they convey information, maybe is the best word.
I think we need more terms in this space that are, say, German, right? You have all these terms that are like Latin, French that sound nice, and they're kind of boring. I like the hard consonants of, we need some of these things like Gemeinwohlverständigungsstick. We need some German terms here for some of this 3D modeling.
Well, maybe they'll get involved, and Europe will do some work and become the next Facebook or Google or Microsoft.
Who knows?
Let's see, next slide. So continuing with the themes, everything old is new again. Of all things, audio apps are back, and party lines are big. We're seeing that in a number of apps, and Discourse is probably the most famous. But it'd probably bring a smile to anybody's face that watches old black and white movies and sees, people picking up on those party lines. Deep fakes, they're obviously being used for a lot of bad things, but because you're able to transmit only a small amount of information in order to get the face to resemble whatever the source is looking like in real time, so for facial expressions and speaking, it also means that on a very low bandwidth connection, and that's exactly what the situation is when you're in these collaborative environments and you have many, many people, maybe even hundreds or thousands in some of them, then deepfakes allow a true-to-life avatar, and yet it's still going to reflect the expressions and the mannerisms of the person behind it, but without the need to transmit the amount of data that's going on right now. We're also headed towards some 3D photorealistic objects, and we actually saw a little bit about that in the presentation on AR and VR. This thing called the Fediverse, which in and of itself is never going to become the next thing, but it's a kind of training wheels environment where the plumbing for alternate technologies can evolve and where people can poke and prod. And its big claim to fame is the fact that it inverts the normal relationship where a central source is pushing information out, and you've got all these algorithmic feeds, whether it's in the business application or a social one. And the Fediverse turns that around and provides total control to the person at the client level of what they want to see, how often they want to get it, who they want to see it from. And then all of the plumbing that needs to be worked out in order to make this usable is going to give people a lot of ideas for next generation applications. So it's nothing that people should look at as this is the next big thing, but it's something to look at and kind of kick the tires on to see, wow, what could you do with something like this if it got out of its sandbox? Right. Low-code, no-code app development. So people are used to thinking of that for doing throwaway applications for, say, events, or you just need to put something together very quickly for some purpose. But one of the things that also buys you is the ability to create customized collaboration environments. And they don't necessarily have to be visual text, because you can have backends like GPT-3, which allows you to do actual text conversations, and the system's able to interpret it and return data. Sometimes, if it's been trained properly, it can even mimic what other people are able to give back as an answer. And of course, you could use it as a control environment, and there are some people that are doing that as well. Minecraft, that's in there just because the total number of people that have been exposed to it when they were in school is enormous. So there's a lot of people who can use that for analogies and metaphors for doing something in a virtual world, as well as the fact that Minecraft's designed to teach. So people, both the instructors and the students that are in it, have a kind of framework for being able to present information in a way that's very different from people that weren't exposed to it. And we already talked about the return of agency.
Sure. All right.
So here are some that are actually out there. So Discord people have heard of, Clubhouse. Bramble is an interesting one. When we first looked at that, it was an audio only, and it was kind of copying what Nowhere does, which is one of the immersive 3D apps, except they were doing it in 2D, think kind of like South Park, but without the potty mouth stuff. But now that Bramble's gone live, they were still in a kind of crazy alpha beta when we looked at them originally. They're actually one of the more interesting ones because they're taking this idea of the avatars and the deep fake technology to be able to have these things operate in low bandwidth environments. And at the same time, they're lowering the cognitive load because instead of being a three-dimensional environment where now you've got to worry about, well, where am I in relation to everything else? And where are the people? Are they, if we're only in one building, are we on this floor? Are they on 20 floors below us? And by the way, what is happening 20 floors below us? Even if it's not part of our immediate environment that we want to go to, just the curiosity of the fact that you can see something's happening down there is a bit distracting. So Bramble gives you more like a God's eye view of a floor plan, and you can actually see where the people are from their little avatars. And then as you wander over, you're going to start to hear noises, and it'll seem a little bit like babble. And once you get even closer, all of a sudden now the voices are distinct, and they've integrated a video conferencing facility, so now you'll actually see the people live. The other interesting thing that they've done is the ability to integrate apps into it. So they've got a large collection of entertainment type things because this is a crossover app. It's working on both sides of the fence, but you can also bring productivity apps into it, including any arbitrary live streaming things. So you can, if you want, do conventional presentations in it. But it's definitely something to go take a look at. It's not necessarily the next big thing because nobody really knows what that is, but it will give you thoughts and ideas, and it's definitely got some possibilities. The immersive apps, these are 3D. So the first one, Nowhere, is an actual 3D application. Our Visio and Avatar are designed to provide additional facilities. So Avatar actually has hardware, a 360-degree camera, and so each person has to have that, so it's specialized equipment, but it does allow you to have a novel kind of video conferencing that's distinctly different from the flat environment that we're all used to. And our Visio started out as being able to have 3D objects, say CAD-CAM type things, brought into an arbitrary set of environments. They had hooks into a whole set of the most popular of the video conferencing systems. And now they've progressed out from there, and they're into doing the digital twinning, which is pretty interesting, not just for people, but for objects. So it's kind of interesting the direction that they're evolving into.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I've got an account on Nowhere, and I got to say, my activity's gone nowhere on it yet. I mean, these things are so tip of the. I mean, do you envision a lot, companies subscribing to this? Do you think this is mostly going to stay in the individual user, or companies are going to, pay for somebody else to develop their own version of Nowhere for their company?
Nowhere in that type technology is kind of a tough call right now. You can look at them as an early entrant into the metaverse because most of the discussions about the metaverse revolve around 3D environments. So in that sense, Nowhere is here long before the others get there. applications to use for collaboration, it's interesting, but they may be resource constrained in terms of being able to move fast enough to integrate things that people find useful. The other side of it is the cognitive load. So they bring up the kind of interesting thing of what happens when interfaces basically go away totally. And one thing that I've noticed is it's not necessarily obvious how you move around and do things. So they do have a cheat sheet, but it's a pretty densely typed, I think, single page with a lot of the commands on it. And so there's a fair amount of keyboard orientation to get through it. And it breaks the suspension of disbelief. And
Yeah.
so I think Nowhere probably wants to look at their interface and figure out how can it be transparent to do what you actually want to do without having to explicitly have control systems. Or if you are going to have a control system, it just needs to be something that maybe is context sensitive in terms of where you are, but it's consistent in how it operates.
Yeah.
But they're a blank slate, so that's kind of the cool thing about Nowhere.
I do agree. I think instruction is necessary because I'll be honest. I remember when Mist came out. I don't even know. I'm dating myself 10 or 15 years ago or something.
Try 30 or 40.
Well, yeah, there you go. That's all them. I swear it's like I'm sitting to roam around the main thing for like 30 minutes. I couldn't figure out anything. It's like there was no, like, I guess you had to explore and, you give commands to do something. But if there was an instruction manual, I didn't have it. I sat there for like 40 minutes. I'm like, this is the stupidest thing. I can't do anything. So I'm sure, you'll have to have something to help idiots like me, know how to engage these interfaces in a little bit of an intuitive way. And if not, at least give some basic explanations there.
Well, it brings up a good point. Right now, there's not really standards for how do you operate in these immersive environments. There's definitely things that could be pulled in from the video game environments. And there's obviously a subgroup of people who are very familiar with that. But that's probably an area where companies should try and collaborate with each other and figure out, okay, what's going to be the equivalent of a minimizing box on a flat 2D display. At this point, all of us can look at Windows or a Mac or Android or iPad or whatever, and there's a fair amount that we can navigate based on the fact that they all operate the same way, even if the widgets and arrows and buttons and whatnot have a slightly different appearance. But our intuition about what's going to happen when we tap these things is consistent. And that's not true yet for these other apps. So that's an emergent property that we're going to have to see.
I think that's going to have to evolve. That's going to be an area, just sort of like, how do I interact with things? How do I navigate from one domain to another domain? How do I engage apps or function? I mean, there's some fundamental things there that, like you say, it's very much, and I think the different environments are focusing on one of those things versus the other. But I think you'll get more standards over time here.
Yeah, right now they're definitely in the exploratory phase.
Absolutely.
People are sorting out what's interesting to do. So let's see, we talked about the first two, non-fungible tokens and the DAOs we can talk a little bit about. So NFTs are interesting for the collaboration tools for the reasons we started to talk about in the themes. They become a mechanism for knowledge because their ownership is only one aspect of it, right? An NFT is proving ownership of something else. So now that something else can be anything. And these things can be that. So at a very simplistic level, they could represent, say, passing certain certificates or having certain degrees, or even provable knowledge of something. That's the interesting thing about
it. It's almost like another factor of authentication in some sense to me.
Yeah, that's one part of it, definitely. And I think we actually talk about things like bio passports because we started doing this stuff at the beginning of the pandemic when that was still going to be a big thing.
Parts of, some of the ways the NFTs are being used today to me kind of silly, right? Like, for example, if I have a a picture of Justin Bieber, and I've got an NFT that proves he's the one who sent it to me. It's like, but it still looks like anybody else's picture. I mean, is there actually a value in the fact that I can prove I got this picture of Justin Bieber from Justin Bieber? To me, I don't see a lot of value in that. But I think, as in general, having something that is non-disprovable is good in some domains. I just think in the art domain, I'm a little skeptical. But
well, I mean, for collectibles, right? That's the metaphor that goes on there. Pick anything, whether it's old cars or baseball cards or any kind of trading cards, Pokemons, Pikachu's, all that stuff. They're only as valuable as other people decide that they want them more than you do, right?
Right, exactly.
So all the trick with all of those things is find something that a lot of people want, or at least enough people want, that they're willing to put a premium over something that other people who have no interest in it just look at it and say, well, even if you gave it to me, I wouldn't take it. So that there's that part of it. But the NFTs also have other interesting things. I mean, think of them in terms of delegating authority, right? Suppose that I've got the ability to make certain levels of decisions, and I don't want to have to make absolutely all of them, or I'm interested in mentoring somebody and bringing them up along. So suppose that I can temporarily grant them the NFT to be able to make at least some restricted set of decisions, right? This person now has my authority inside the organization, so their decisions stand. They're not going to get questioned. That's something that we don't have today. And again, NFTs and DAOs to me are very closely intertwined for these kinds of collaborations and decision consensus making.
Sure.
But there's very novel things that you can use them for. The direct use of them for provenance, proving the ownership of something, that's a metaphor that's coming kind of out of legal contracts. And that was the first group that really looked at them and said, okay, wow, this is a one-to-one correspondence. But again, as with some of the other things, we're just at the beginning of trying to figure out, so what are the non-one-to-one correspondences? What are the things that are not so obvious that these things can be used for?
Yeah. And I think that'll emerge over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a statement; it's a question.
Yeah.
Where do these things go? Once you have something that's unalterable in the sense that it's publicly viewable, so anybody that does try to do anything with it, the chain of ownership and authenticity can be totally traced. What else can you do with that then as simply a metaphor for ownership and contracts? And we're only beginning to start to see that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that will allow different types of business processes to occur that don't currently occur, right? If there's something that you say the owner of a corporation must do X, Y, and Z, but they're limited by bandwidth on what they can do. But like you say, if we've got some way to firmly establish proxy in a way that is unassailable, that might, change fundamentally some business processes that are being done.
Yeah, and I think that leads to the whole agent-driven software. Like, I don't really like the term smart contracts, because what these things are, they're software, and in reality, you can think of them, they're much closer to being agents, because they can act on one or more individuals' behalfs, and they act autonomously.
Right.
And there's been a lot of historical work on the computer science, academic, and in the commercial sector on agents. And so don't be surprised if you see a lot of that work starting to migrate over into whatever you want to call these things, the APIs that allow the smart contracts. And that may be the next explosive big thing that happens with the DAOs and the blockchain and the ability to execute this arbitrary code. Because as we've talked about internally, if you think about it, what you're really seeing in something like the Ethereum blockchain, that was the first one to really expose the smart contracts, is it's a distributed computer API. And that's the real way to think about it. And once you start thinking about it as a distributed API that can execute fairly arbitrary code. Now, all of a sudden, the metaphors and the analogies that people start to think of are much, much more expansive than simply contracts.
Right. Good point.
Next slide. So here we get into a little bit about the Fediverse, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because, again, it's what we discussed earlier. It's not that this is going to be the next thing, but it shows you what's possible in an environment where almost everything is peer-to-peer. And again, you can see the underlying plumbing and the kind of issues that have to be worked on. Security and privacy are issues. And it's kind of funny how the intersection of cyber and information security and zero trust are kind of coalescing into something that also is going to encompass privacy, because privacy to me is inseparable from the security side of it. How can you have privacy if you don't have a very, very high level of security?
Yeah, and the interesting thing to me about this conceptually is, right, what we're talking about, let's say, is a virtual agora, right? Like the fact that, here's a infrastructure platform that allows people to meet and congregate and aggregate and collaborate. But there still has to be, isn't there some implicit trust that the person that's providing that virtual platform that we're doing the interchange is, trustworthy, is not stealing information, or, I guess if we have things like, NFTs, if the point is, can I create a platform that allows you and me to interchange things that guarantees the person establishing the platform can't steal stuff from us?
Well, that's the big question that comes up with all the layer 2 systems in the blockchain. So when transactions are posted directly onto the blockchain, that issue doesn't come up. The issue that you have to deal with, and that's the famous proof of stake and proof of work and the rest of those algorithms, is you want to make sure that the miners who are distributed, that nobody there is going to alter the transactions. So that part got taken care of and is pretty bulletproof at this point. The problem now is the transaction performance isn't very high. And so you've got all these layer 2 solutions that basically act as aggregators and buffers. But there's no real equivalent of the consensus algorithms that exist at the blockchain level for those people. It's
and the problem is, to me, Marc, is that stuff, and taking Bitcoin as a specific example, right? It's the proof of work is so computationally intensive that it fundamentally limits transactional throughput, right? So, to me, is there going to be a risk reward balance that has to be conducted that says, how can I allow encryption and some version of proof of work that is scalable, right? Because if we're going to take this to its ultimate extreme, and I have an environment where it's a Internet of Things environment where I'm doing any real-time on the fly collaboration with objects and methods galore, doing that seamlessly and securely at a rate that would allow the world to do it is, with current technology, is transactionally unfeasible, I think, today.
Well, there's also a second point that comes up, and that's not often talked about with the Web3 and its options and possibilities for collaboration, because we're on the collaboration and not the blockchain emerging tech. But I think the real issue is the transaction costs. Even if you somehow tomorrow found a way to make the consensus algorithm super fast, and some of these things like the sharding zero knowledge ones, I don't remember the exact technical details, but there are things that can operate much, much more quickly and with far lower computational costs. And of course, the proof of stake is the current one that many companies are trying to move to, certainly in the Ethereum environment. But the problem is underneath, if you look at the economics, even if you got the transaction costs down to, I don't know, pick a number, 5 cents or something like that, and it's wildly below what the costs are now. Do you really want to pay, or who is going to pay for every text message that gets sent to be posted on the
Well, that's the
blockchain?
thing. You don't want the cost of a cookie, a guaranteed real cookie, to be the cost of an actual car.
Yes. And so to me, it's less about looking at the technology. When you look at collaboration in the Web3 environment, which is intimately tied to the blockchain, it's really transaction costs. Transaction costs that look good if you're talking about doing something like a Visa or MasterCard transaction are still totally unsustainable for any kind of social collaborative application. And so one of the odd things that may happen is for collaborative tools, we might see what are essentially private in-house blockchains, because if you're doing something for an organization, right, how important is it that the blockchain have the same level of immutability as the public ones?
Totally agree. I think you're going to have things where, something that does some kind of effective, 256, 512-bit hashing algorithm, which you can, as long as you got enough memory and compute, that's something you can do in very, very fast. And is it going to be as good as proof of work? No. But I think for many, many use cases, again, if the virtual, I'm getting a cookie as opposed to a car or a castle, that's probably good enough for 90% of the use cases out there.
Yeah, and then of course, once you've done that, so you've gotten rid of the computational and cost issues for the transaction, and you're using it as an in-house app of some kind, or maybe as a service that people like Amazon and Google and whatnot will provide as an alternative for non-financial uses of blockchain. But the next question that's going to come up right away is, okay, so this is really a big linked list. How big can it get before I'm bashing my way through this thing, when totally different underlying technologies would make a lot more sense?
Right.
And so my pure speculation is that you're going to see some really interesting work on collaboration in the sense of governance, and fair allocation happen in the blockchain, but that the actual implementation of that is probably going to become divorced from the underlying blockchain tech. Just because when people start to use it at scale, they're going to realize there's a lot of value in this for how I can manage and run, whether it's a very large organization or a small one, but especially if it's distributed over large geographic areas and time zones. And that could be even a small number of people. If you've got 10 people in an organization, but they're scattered around the world and they're using this to collaborate, the consensus mechanisms, and by that I mean like the voting kind of protocols that we talked about before,
Right.
not the blockchain ones, and that fair allocation, that's how you figure out how to run large organizations. And you can mix in the NFTs so that you kind of address the trust issues, and people are going to discover that, you know what, I can have all of that and I don't need the blockchain underneath for this.
Right.
So next slide. So low code. Here again, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but the appeal of being able to throw away apps is basically here. I mean, when you do searches on the low code, no code app startups and old line companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, everybody is doing this and jumped in. It's just enormous. And that means they're exploring the largest space that they can, because everybody wants to have something that's unique about what their approach to this is. And we're at the point where a person with no programming background can already create certain kinds of apps and just toss them, and that they could do it in a few hours or less. That's going to have definite impacts on content creation, for the creative part of the audience, and also for collaboration, because all of a sudden you might need a collaborative tool that's fairly specialized to a particular project, and it wouldn't make any sense for a centralized organization to create it and then maintain it and take all the work that goes into keeping that thing around if it's only going to be used for a few weeks, days, or months. but the appeal of being able to have something so tailored is going to be really attractive. So you should definitely get ready for that kind of
And
thing.
the only thing I'd throw out there in that is if you put that in the context of like open source, right? Where it's like I'm going to get a bunch of these libraries of junk that's already written for me, and I don't have the skills to know what's in there. How do I guarantee that there's not some malicious security junk in there that when I go and get all this free stuff to cobble together, that I don't act, that each one of those no code apps is itself a black box. There's definitely some security implications there. I was talking to the CIO of one of the top 5 banks in the country, and they wouldn't touch that stuff with a 10-foot pole. So for individual user kind of stuff, but when my only caveat there is, if that stuff's all in the open source realm, that is I don't think we've even touched the surface of potential security implications of that.
No, but you bring up an interesting point. Think about how many commercial packages have open source software embedded in it.
Well, look at that, right? That's what happened, right? We had that big security thing a couple months ago with the that app. Everybody uses that log daemon to tail log files. Everybody's using it. Nobody's really tested it. Massive security vulnerability, and I think you're going to even that will exponentially increase with a lot of this stuff. I'm just throwing it out there. It's not that it isn't great to use things that I don't have to know about. But of course, if it's a black box, I don't know about it. That's the other side of that coin.
Well, ultimately, that may restore some balance to the current open source environment where you have people creating the code for free, right? Often uncompensated, while other organizations make enormous amounts of money off of it. So maybe what's going to happen is the organizations that are using them in actual products are going to have to assume the responsibility for doing the security audits and ensuring that these vulnerabilities are quickly identified and then fed back to the actual maintainers and developers.
Or you have a bifurcation of the market where, just like in Linux, right, where you've got the red hats, which actually have a team of people that go through all that stuff and will honor and indemnify support, versus the Kubuntus and Ubuntus that are literally like caveat emptor.
Exactly. And GPT-3, of course, people shouldn't ignore that's what's behind a lot of the chatbot technology and the ability to have natural language interfaces. That's exploded in use, and there are more startups using it behind the scenes than you could easily count.
Good to know.
And Minecraft, we've talked about a bit in some of the earlier ones. It's interesting, again, mostly because you've just got a lot of people who are familiar with it. Anybody under 30.
I was going to say, except me. After my experience with Myst, I wasn't going to touch Minecraft with a 10-foot pole.
They've almost certainly been exposed to it, even if they didn't spend much time in it. And it means that you do have a developer base. There's these large groups of people who can do at least basic things in those environments. So Minecraft itself, who knows? Whether that's the particular thing that becomes the launching pad for other applications is kind of like the training ground, training wheels is the way I think about it. And but you never know.
I think it'll certainly help people think about the mode of interacting in those environments, right? How do I do connections, integration, accessing things? I think whether that itself stays versus something like it, but I think it gives people an example of how to build into those kind of environments.
And also think about the user interfaces. I mean, children are very intuitive, so the things that they build in those environments that are live and can actually do something, it's often very obvious how to manipulate that, because they're going for a direct one-to-one correspondence with their experiences of how things work. And because they're still learning, they haven't had all of that creativity and intuitions about just mapping direct real world experience onto how they want something to behave and interact beaten out of them. I mean, there's a really good quote from Carl Sagan, and it goes, we all start out as natural born scientists, and then education beats it out of us.
Hey, we're kind of turning into a timing punk. I don't know if there's any other points we want to talk about here before we wrap things up.
Yep. So the interesting ones on this that we haven't mentioned are the ZenKits hypernote. So this is pretty interesting because essentially it allows you to create a knowledge graph. Rome Reach, which I think got renamed as Rome Research, they're not something that I would try and actually do work on. They're interesting to explore, but they're fairly small, and the value of them is to go and look at what might be. ZenKits, on the other hand, is a large going concern, and Hypernote is available for free, at least on the individual use for people that want to kick the tires on it. And it's a different way of organizing things. If Airtable is about spreadsheets and Notion is about databases, then Hypernotes is about mind maps and knowledge graphs.
Great. I love mind maps. I think they're way underutilized. I think they're very helpful for especially the creative process.
I love them. I mean, once I stumbled across them, I was like, wow, why didn't somebody tell me about this?
They're great. And there's a bunch of free ones out there too, which is wonderful.
Yep.
Some final takeaways here, Marc.
So the return of agency, there's an attempt definitely to put the individual back in control. We're beginning to see a bit of power rebalancing, and interestingly, the whole Web3 crowd is kind of the big push behind that, along with all of the security breaches. We're seeing an era of digital artifacts, things that have no tangible instantiation, but all of a sudden it's possible to monetize them. And the art scene is definitely, anybody who's been on OpenSeas, is leading the charge on that. But we're going to be the beneficiaries of all the technologies that get worked out in that. You're seeing fairly routine issues with thefts and glitches and things going wrong. And so the art group is unfortunately the ones with the arrows in their back. But what's going to come out of that is something that's much more stable and secure and usable. And with that, I think we have to wrap it up. And we're going to say thanks very much. This has been an experience for us, and it's the last of, I think, 6 that we did.
Yeah, I think so. 6. And we appreciate everybody's time. I haven't seen any questions. I don't know if anybody has any questions. You feel free to ask them if you want. I don't see any. But we really appreciate your time and attention, and we've really enjoyed these. And do we have anything upcoming that we had to talk about? There's supposed to be links to register for upcoming episodes and emerging technology series. Is that in the slide deck?
No, it's in the Bright Talk.
It's in the Bright Talk. Okay, great. Yeah, so you'll see that in the Bright Talk for, and plus as our LinkedIn profiles are there, and we'll have a survey. So with that, thank you all for your time, and we look forward to seeing you with more different types of talks in the future. Thanks a lot.
And if people have any ideas for topics they would like to see, we'd love to hear about them.
That'd be great. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Have a great day.
Bye.